right. Welcome back to In the Box with Alex. I'm your host, Alex Baumgartner. We haven't been here in over a year, but what better time to do it than the Stanley Cup playoffs? I am joined by my friend Colby Guy, Florida Panthers beat reporter for Florida Hockey Now and the Palm Beach Post. We are just about an hour and a half away from puck drop in Game 1 of the Eastern Conference Finals. The Florida Panthers haven't been to the Eastern Conference Finals since 1996. And if my math and Colby's math is adding up, neither of us were born because we're both 0-1s. But we're so happy to be here, talk to you guys about this series. Colby, thanks for joining us. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. And you know what would be better? A good hockey game tonight. So, Colby, the Panthers, first of all, tremendous run just to get into the playoffs. We know all about it. 6 in a row wins. Then you get the overtime point against Toronto. A couple things go right for the Panthers on the other side of the East where they get into the playoffs by just 1 point. They defeat the Boston Bruins, which were the greatest regular season team in NHL history. Then they take down the Toronto Maple Leafs in 5 games. We've been sitting around for 6 days waiting for a game, and we finally have Game 1 of the Eastern Conference Finals. And this might be the toughest series yet for the Florida Panthers because the Carolina Hurricanes systematically have one of the best teams in the NHL, and they've been doing it for years. Analytically, as Paul Maurice said in the press conference a couple days ago, they're the best team in the league, Carolina Hurricanes. Colby, just this matchup for the Panthers at face value, where do you think Carolina ranks compared to the other two teams they played?
Well, the thing with the Panthers is that we have seen them win in multiple different ways to be able to combat against maybe a bit more of a swarm defensive system like Carolina is. Boston's a team that was structured like that too. And you look at game 6 of that series, the Panthers stretched them out and were able to start a big shootout game there where they're able to outscore them. They're able to out-defend them. Sergei Bobrovsky's on a roll as well. So him continuing to be like that is going to be very important in how this series goes. But I think it all depends on Carolina's goaltending too, because Frederik Andersen has been good in the small sample size he's had. But you look at his history and his past, he's not exactly the guy. So I think a lot of it boils down to the two teams' goaltending. I think the Panthers have the team in front of Bobrovsky to be able to break down that system a little bit, at least better than what New Jersey was able to do because they were a speed-only team coming into it pretty much, where Carolina was able to shut down their speed, but now they have the guys that are able to be a bit stronger and get past the defense. So I think this should be pretty much a coin flip that comes down to goaltending.
And you mentioned the Carolina Devils series. Carolina had 6 games throughout the playoffs. There were 3+ goal games. They're 4-2 in it. And when we look at that Devils series, there's quite a few blowouts on both sides. I know the Devils got that 1-8-4 win, but other than that OT win in Game 5 that clinched it for Carolina, they were kind of running away in that series against the Devils. Now, as we mentioned earlier, analytically, the Carolina Hurricanes are by far one of the top teams, not only left in the playoffs, but just looking at the 16 teams that were in the playoffs, their penalty kill is 90%. They've only allowed 3 goals in the playoffs on the penalty kill, and I believe they might have 4 shorthanded goals, somewhere around there. So their penalty kill, they've scored more goals, or at least the same, than they've given up. Now, the Panthers play a good forechecking game, but so do the Hurricanes. The Panthers get great offensive support from their defensemen, but so do the Hurricanes. And as you mentioned, Sergei Bobrovsky, the way he's been playing, Frederik Andersen so far is 5-0 in the playoffs, a 180 goals against average. Colby said this is a coin flip, and looking at all my notes and just looking at what I've looked at as well, I believe it's a coin flip as well. So, Colby, how important is this Game 1 tonight? We know the Panthers have lost Game 1. We know they were down 3-1 in the series. We know they can come back. But in this specific series where it is a coin flip, how important is getting off to a good start in Game 1, playing a close, tight game and not letting Carolina run away with this for the Panthers' success in this conference final matchup?
Well, the thing with Carolina, too, is that they've been one of the best home teams in the playoffs. So to be able to steal a home game right off the bat in that raucous environment that is PNC Arena, that's one of the most underrated environments in the league to go into. I think that's important to kind of set the tone there, because you don't want to give them too much to be excited about and have them build off the momentum of a wild crowd and a crazy game. So you want to be able to silence that, just like they did in Toronto, just like they did to at least towards the end of that Boston series, where they were able to shut everything down in that game 5. But when you look at the Toronto series, the whole pressure of it being the first time that Toronto was in the second round, you knew you're gonna have a crazy crowd that game 1. They were able to shut that down and shut down their top guns, which was the most important part too. And they were able to kind of wean the momentum going into games 2 and 3. So I think game 1 is going to be very important here.
And Colby, you mentioned the pressure in the Toronto series against the Leafs, and we know that the Panthers have kind of been playing with house money for at least the first 2 rounds, getting past Boston, just getting into the playoff. In my opinion, I think the house money is off the table because now we're at the Final Four. Whoever gets the first 4 here is going to the Stanley Cup Final, which is obviously the end goal for any team competing in an NHL season. I don't think Carolina has pressure either. They've been in situations where they've won multiple rounds. They've been to the conference finals with this relative to this group. Do you think who do you think has the most pressure on them in this series, or is it even? Because I'm looking more, obviously the Carolina Hurricanes are the favorite, and they had the good regular season. The Panthers got to where they are based off of just hunting teams down the last 20 or so games. Do you think there's more pressure on the Hurricanes, or do you think it's kind of just flip a coin once again?
I mean, the Panthers got here because no matter what that was put in front of them, they just didn't feel any pressure at all. So I wouldn't say there's any pressure on the Panthers, just because they've been so adverse already to the point where whatever's in front of them doesn't really matter, and they're approaching it the same way, and they're playing a style of game that works. As far as Carolina goes, they just haven't had as much pressure on them at all. But maybe, I mean, the thing with Carolina is that they're still missing so many guys with injury, even though they're getting Teuvo Teravainen back. They're still missing Andrei Svechnikov. They're still missing Match Pacioretty. And they have these guys were injured excuse. But I don't think they're worried about that either. So, I mean, I'd say it's a coin flip. I don't think there's exactly an insurmountable amount of pressure on either team. But then again, you're looking at this Carolina team that's been on the fringes of being a Stanley Cup contender for about 5-6 years now with the same core. Rather than the Panthers, this is only their second time even being past the second round with this core. And it's still, both of these teams have a relatively young core, but Carolina's been there a lot longer. And I think maybe there's a slight edge in pressure to Carolina, but I don't think there's much.
And Colby just mentioned Teuvo Teravainen is coming back. I believe he missed the 9 games to a hand injury. So Carolina gets a guy who has won a Stanley Cup, won in 2015 with the Chicago Blackhawks. Keep in mind, he was a very young player, not really necessarily a pivotal player to that team. But when he got to Carolina, he is one of the better players on that team. And Carolina doesn't necessarily have that standout star. Now, so they have Sebastian Aho, and during the regular season, they had all-star Andrei Svechnikov. But they're a very complete team. I mean, tied with Sebastian Aho in team points for the playoffs is Jordan Martinook with 10. And Jordan Martinook's not a guy that you would think is going to be leading a team through 2 rounds in the Stanley Cup playoffs. But like the Florida Panthers Ryan Lomberg is ready to go. Now, just based off what it looks like in practice, it looks like he will draw in for Zach Dalpe. How important will Ryan Lomberg be to this series? He hasn't played since the Boston series, and we know how good Lomberg could be in the playoffs. Panthers have had a great record without him, but in this specific series, Colby, do you think that Ryan Lomberg coming back is very big for the Panthers, or is it maybe just adding a little bit more depth to that team?
Well, I mean, when you look at the minutes the fourth line played, specifically in that Toronto series, I don't think that fourth line added a whole lot. But when you put Ryan Lomberg in there, He's a guy that plays with a lot of speed, plays with a lot of physicality. And although they weren't winning those games against Boston some of the time, he was getting under a lot of guys' skin, and you could tell that fourth line, or I guess he was on the third line at the time, but he was still pushing the pace there, generating chances, and I think that's going to translate on the fourth line as well. And he's a guy that's worked really well next to Eric Stahl too. When you look at earlier in the season, like in February, when this team was playing pretty thin with a lot of injuries, and they've had to play a line of Lomberg, Cousins, Stahl as like their second line. So I think putting that line back together, at least with Lomberg and Stahl, I think that's going to help. I mean, Dalpe did a fine job in relief, and that line played all right, but I think especially on the defensive end as well, because Lomberg is pretty underrated on the fact that he gets his sticks in the right places, and he's a smart guy on the defensive end. So I think adding his speed and his physicality definitely helps.
And as Colby just mentioned, Zach Dalpe did do a fine job. He kind of came into this not knowing if he would play, was the captain of the Charlotte Checkers. Kind of been in and out of both lineups this season just because when the Panthers in December, January-ish, needed some extra bodies with all those injuries, Zach Dalpe came in, did his shift, scored a big goal. I think it was game 6 to make it 4-4. It was either 4-4 or 5-5. I think it was 4-4 in that win against Boston. But before we get on to the next point, we're going to talk about prize picks. If you want to bet on the Florida Panthers, Carolina Hurricanes players, go to prize picks. It is legal in the state of Florida. You're not betting on the team to win. You're betting on the players, like a shot on goal prop, how many hits. I took the Sam Bennett over 4 hits. He's been hitting around that number, so I'm going to go over on Sam Bennett tonight. But make sure you use code 5, that is FIVE, at Prize Picks. It will match your initial deposit up to $100. The entire network at 5 Reasons Sports uses it. It's a great way to get some betting into this game because, once again, sportsbooks are not legal in the state of Florida. However, Prize Picks is, so make sure you head over to Prize Picks and use code FIVE for your next deposit. Colby, we have talked so much about both the Panthers and the Canes and how even of a team they are. Who's going to put the Panthers over the edge in this series, in your opinion? What's that one player that can get them on the other side of this 50-50 or 60-40, whatever the odds are? Who's going to take the Panthers to the next level, in your opinion?
Oh, I think it has to be Sergei Bobrovsky. I mean, when you look at the way the Panthers were playing before he came in Game 5 there and really stole the show there, I think it begins and ends with Sergei Bobrovsky because we've seen the team struggles all season, and it's stemmed to when Sergei Bobrovsky has had those down moments, and this team's defensive structure just leaks out sometimes because it doesn't exactly have the right guys in the right places at times. So you need Sergei Bobrovsky to be on his game if the Panthers are going to win the series. And you look at especially what he did in that Toronto series, I think that's the guy you have to watch.
And Colby just mentioned Sergei Bobrovsky. Sergei Bobrovsky has been absolutely standout, especially in that Game 5 clinching overtime win. I believe he had 50 saves, 7-2 record in the playoffs. Sergei Bobrovsky, every time we talk to him, Colby would know this, every time post-game, he always talks about having fun. Even if they lose, it's like, I had fun. I enjoy playing hockey. Sergei Bobrovsky keeps his eyes on the prize. He just loves the game. And I think Colby is 100% accurate on that. This is going to be it's who can win the goalie matchup. Because Frederik Andersen, when he has come in this playoff, they've been splitting between him and Raanta, but he's the guy with the 5 wins, no losses, great goals against average. The Panthers are going to need a great goaltending performance. You can't win the Stanley Cup or a series if you have subpar goaltending. Sergei Bobrovsky has been playing up to that 2-time Vezina standard. For me, I'm going to take Matthew Tkachuk. Matthew Tkachuk is one of the big reasons why the Florida Panthers were still kicking in January when nothing was really going for them. Had a couple big games down the stretch just for them to get into the playoffs, including that Washington game where them and Washington were still battling for position, and he got that late goal. Matthew Tkachuk, not necessarily huge on the point department in that Toronto series. However, the Florida Panthers don't necessarily need point production from their superstar player all the time because of how good that second line with Sam Bennett and Nick Cousins has been. We saw how good Nick Cousins was in that Toronto series, including the game-winning goal. So if Matthew Tkachuk can get a couple points on the board and keep up that forecheck and that high-octane pressure in the offensive zone that they did have in that Toronto series and the Boston series, I think the Florida Panthers, well, maybe not necessarily win this series, but they're going to keep it close. As we all mentioned earlier, it is almost a coin flip. So Matthew Tkachuk for me, Colby for Sergei Bobrovsky for Colby. That's the two guys we're looking out for. Now, Colby, I know you paid a lot of attention throughout this playoff to the Panthers. However, looking at the Carolina side, who's the one guy that you think has had a good playoff and could be a problem or maybe a thorn in the Panthers for this series?
Well, I'm going to stick with goaltending here because, I mean, Frederik Andersen in the games that he's been asked to play, granted, you have the back and forth and maybe the inconsistencies of one guy playing and the other guy playing, but the guy is 5-0, and he's made the big saves when they've needed him to, especially in that game 5, against the New Jersey Devils there. So, I mean, again, this thing boils down to goaltending, and both teams have goalies who are on a good run right now, but have been pretty inconsistent. So, just where the consistencies lie is where it lies for me.
I'm going to look at Brent Burns. Brent Burns has had quite the playoff, has 8 points. He's a +8. Like I mentioned earlier in the show, both the Florida Panthers and the Carolina Hurricanes have had a lot of offensive help from their defense, both in the regular season and in the postseason. Brent Burns, for the Panthers fans that don't know him, he's kind of playing a very similar role to what Brandon Montour has been doing in the playoffs for the Panthers, where they're just getting a lot of points up on the board. They're going to have to watch Brent Burns, and, Carolina doesn't necessarily have a standout player in this playoff in terms of point production. However, if you look up and down their lineup, they're getting points from everyone, whether it's a Jordan Staal, a Jordan Martinhook, a Jesper Fast, Seth Jarvis. He's kind of like, if we're comparing him to a Panthers player, him and Anton Lundell, 12th and 13th overall picks, they've both been having pretty good playoffs. This series, for me, has been so hard to look at because when we look at the Boston series, we just look at, they have Pastrnak, they have Marchand, they have the Vezina goaltender in Linus Ullmark. They had a complete team. When we look at Toronto, they had the core four, they had a great top 6 offense in the regular season. When we look at the Carolina Hurricanes, this team is just so bought into their system, and they have been for years. And that's almost like what it looks almost at face value what the Florida Panthers have been doing the last 2 months, where they really bought into that Paul Maurice system where they're like, we're going to play one way. We have to play one way. We can't pick and choose 50-50, which is what Paul Maurice said a couple days ago. How similar are these two teams really, Colby? Like, when you look at the two, just between their center depth, their defense, their goaltending, it's almost like we're looking at not necessarily a mirror image, but these two teams are very, very close in terms of just how they're built and how they play their games.
The thing with me about these two teams is that Carolina's is the version that has it a little bit more figured out defensively, has a better structure, has more of those defensive-minded players like a Jacob Slavin, for example, and Brett Pesce and all these other guys that hold things down on the defensive end and really make it difficult for teams to break past, with a pretty good offensive group that's able to push the pace when it needs to. But, I mean, past Sebastian Aho and Andrei Svechnikov, who's currently unavailable, I mean, they don't have the deepest forward core, but they have a lot of talent there. Or I guess they don't have the most talented forward core, but it's not the they have a deep forward core, but it's not the most talented. But when you look at Florida, they're still learning how to play that style of game, and they've been doing a good job of it the last couple of months. But there are some holes on that defensive end, namely, I mean, Mark Stahl, although he makes some pretty big plays back there, he's a guy that he's getting up there in age. He gets blown past a lot, and he makes some mistakes back there. And you look at the forward core, though, you have a lot of talent there that's able to carry them through. Like you have an Alexander Barkov up front who's able to make up for all these defensive errors from the back end, but also be a guy that puts up some points. You have Matthew Tkachuk, who's pretty self-explanatory, and he's in the top 5 in points despite not putting up a whole lot against Toronto. And you just have a deep complement of players after that who can put up 40 goals or 70 points in a season. So they're the more fast-paced style of team between the two, but they both can play that style of game.
And before we move into our last segment, I just want to point out a couple things. There are a lot of storylines in this matchup. And now, how important that is, I don't really necessarily think it is, but I think it's kind of cool to point out how Shane Gostisbehere is from Pembroke Pines, Florida. Then we got Paul Maurice coaching against the team that he used to coach multiple times. And he said that he coached 3 of their coaches, including Rod Brindamore, who is the head coach of the Carolina Hurricanes. You had Gustav Forsling and Eetu Luostarinen, who at one point were members of the Carolina Hurricanes system. There's just so much going on in these matchups. And we have 2 Sun Belt teams in the Eastern Conference, 2 Sun Belt teams in the Western Conference. It's really a good thing for Southern hockey. I know Colby had a great tweet a couple days ago where he said we have an all Sun Belt or all Southern market conference finals matchup. Just before we move into our last segment, Colby, seeing Southern markets have the Final Four, how big is this for these hockey markets or hockey in the South in general?
Oh, you have a team like the Carolina Hurricanes on full display, which, I mean, it's had a very crazy fan base for years. And I mean, watching games with that team in that stadium, it's one hell of an atmosphere. So giving them the floor in the conference final is crazy. But I mean, you look at the way people have reacted around South Florida to the Panthers. There are more people asking about the Panthers. There are more people walking around in Panther shirts. And when you look at Matthew Tkachuk, he was talking about how the buzz completely changed once the playoffs started too. So, I mean, both these teams have a chance to really change the view of hockey in the South, because you see all these people talking about how the ratings are going to dip because these teams are teams that Canadian people don't necessarily care about. So, I mean, both that series and Vegas Dallas, which is a rematch of a prior conference final too from the bubble, I think both of those are going to be pretty big.
All right, we're moving into our last segment of the show. We're just about an hour and 15, 20 minutes away from puck drop. We have 8 p.m. Eastern time puck drop for game 1 between the Carolina Hurricanes and the Florida Panthers in Raleigh, North Carolina. We have Colby Guy here from Florida Hockey Now. Colby, before we head off, I want to know from you. Colby's covered the team the entire season. Colby, what do the Panthers need? If there's one thing for them to win this series, if there's one thing that they need to be better at than the Carolina Hurricanes, what do they need to beat the Canes?
Well, I mean, I already exhausted the goaltending point, so I'll just have to say that their top guns have to show up as well. I mean, you need Alexander Barkov to outscore Sebastian Aho, and you need Matthew Tkachuk to steal the series as well. Because what the Panthers have in firepower, the Carolina Hurricanes have in all 4 of their lines. And that 4th line is not necessarily a complete line. They have 3 lines that can go at it. But you need those top 2 lines to be on their best game, because look at the Boston series, the top line wasn't necessarily doing the job, but the middle 6 was. And then you had in second round, they had the first and the third line going. The second line wasn't necessarily going until the end of that series. So you just need to have all 3 lines playing consistently, and you need to have your top guns running the show here.
And I think Colby is 100% right, so I'm not going to piggyback off of that, but I'm going to say that 90% penalty kill for the Carolina Hurricanes is huge. We've seen teams carry those penalty kills on deep runs, including the Montreal Canadiens a couple of years ago, where they went on a spectacular run to the Stanley Cup Finals, kind of carrying off of that amazing penalty kill they had. The Florida Panthers, I think if they can kind of break down that Carolina Hurricanes power play early in the series, that's going to be huge just for them getting confidence and maybe putting a thought in the back of the head that the Carolina Hurricanes, like, we have to be a little bit more careful on our very aggressive PK forecheck, because as we've seen all year, the Carolina Hurricanes play a very aggressive penalty kill, and it's worked out for them under Rod Brind'Amour's system. Colby, thank you so much for joining us. Colby Guy, once again, from Florida Hockey Now. He's done spectacular work the last 2 years covering the Florida Panthers. Colby, can you tell the fans where they can find your work and just plug everything?
Yeah, so you can find my work on FloridaHockeyNow.com and in the Palm Beach Post, and you can find me on Twitter at Colby D Guy.
All right, guys, that is Colby D Guy on Twitter. Thank you once again to Colby Guy from Florida Hockey Now and the Palm Beach Post. Thank you, Manny, in the back, for producing. One of the busiest guys in Miami. We are just about an hour and 10 minutes away from puck drop. Once again, make sure you subscribe here to the 5 Reasons Sports YouTube channel. Hit subscribe. We're going to try and do a couple more shows. I know we haven't been too busy on the Panthers side in terms of YouTube content, but we have been doing a lot of article content and reporting content over there on this site. Make sure you follow me here at Baumgartner 91. It's time for the Eastern Conference Finals, guys. 27 years since this community, since this area has been able to experience this. Thanks a lot for watching, and we'll see you guys soon here on In the Box with Alex, presented by the 5 Reasons Sports Network.